I never thought retirement in the mountains would involve a confrontation with a middle-aged woman in a pressed blazer who believed she owned every square inch of property within a 5-mile radius. But here I was, standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning while she held my snowmobile keys like a trophy. My name is Oliver Brennan, and I had moved to Whitefish, Montana, 6 months ago with dreams of peaceful mountain living. The cabin I bought sat at the end of a long private road that wound through thick pine forests and over 2 frozen creeks. During winter, that road became impassable to regular vehicles. Snow piled up 4 feet high in some sections, and the county didn't plow past the main highway junction. That's why I owned a snowmobile. It wasn't a luxury or a toy for weekend fun. It was my lifeline to civilization, my ambulance in an emergency, my grocery getter, and my only reliable connection to the outside world from December through March. The woman standing in front of me was named Patricia Henderson, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. She had perfectly coiffed blonde hair that didn't move in the bitter wind, foundation applied so thick it could probably stop a bullet, and the kind of smile that made you want to check if your wallet was still in your pocket. Mr. Brennan, I've told you repeatedly that recreational vehicles must be stored out of sight during all months of the year. It's in Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws, Patricia said, dangling my keys just out of reach. I took a deep breath, watching the vapor cloud hang in the frozen air between us. Patricia, that's not a recreational vehicle. That's my primary mode of transportation during winter. The road is completely snowed in. I don't care if you use it to fly to the moon. The rules are the rules. She dropped my keys into her designer handbag with a satisfied click. You can retrieve these from my office once you've moved the snowmobile into your garage where it belongs. My garage is full of my woodworking equipment. That's my business. That's how I make money. I gestured toward the workshop attached to my cabin. And even if it wasn't, I need quick access to the snowmobile. If there's an emergency, I can't waste time clearing out space and maneuvering it through a narrow garage door. Patricia's expression hardened. Then I suggest you prioritize compliance with community standards over your little hobby. You have 48 hours to rectify this situation, or you'll face fines of $200 per day. How did you even get those keys? I asked, anger finally seeping into my voice. They were in the ignition. Very careless, Mr. Brennan. Anyone could have taken them. You should be thanking me for securing your property. She turned on her heel, her boots crunching in the snow that had fallen overnight. Patricia, wait. I followed her toward her gleaming black SUV, which somehow sat in my driveway without a single snowflake on it. You don't understand. I need those keys right now. I have to go into town today. I'm expecting a lumber delivery, and I need to meet the truck at the highway junction to guide them in. Then you'll have to figure out another way, won't you? She opened her car door, started the engine, and drove off, leaving deep tire tracks in the fresh snow. I stood there in disbelief, my breath coming in short, angry bursts that created little clouds in the frigid morning air. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, and the weather forecast called for another storm system to move in by evening. I had maybe 8 hours before the roads became even more treacherous. Walking back to my cabin, I examined the snowmobile. Patricia hadn't just taken the keys from the ignition. She'd taken my spare keys too, the ones I kept in a magnetic box attached to the underframe. I checked 3 times, running my frozen fingers along every possible hiding spot. Gone. She must have seen me retrieve them at some point, filed that information away for future use. Inside my cabin, I poured coffee and tried to think. I'd moved here from Seattle after selling my software company, looking for peace and a chance to work with my hands instead of staring at screens all day. The cabin had been perfect. Isolated but not too remote, beautiful views of the Mission Mountains, and enough space for a proper workshop. The HOA had seemed like a minor annoyance at worst. The development consisted of only 12 properties spread across several square miles, and the association fees were reasonable. I'd skimmed the bylaws, signed the paperwork, and thought nothing more of it. That had been a mistake. Patricia Henderson ran the Pine Ridge HOA like a feudal kingdom, and she was the unquestioned monarch. Over the past 6 months, I'd watched her cite people for having the wrong shade of brown on their deck stain, for parking their car at the wrong angle in their own driveway, and for hanging a bird feeder that was 3 inches too large according to some obscure regulation. Most people just complied because fighting her was exhausting. She had infinite time, infinite energy for confrontation, and a binder full of rules that seemed to expand whenever she needed a new weapon. I'd managed to avoid major conflict until today. Sure, she'd sent me a few warning letters about minor violations. My mailbox was apparently 2 inches shorter than regulation height. My firewood was stacked in a visually chaotic manner. My welcome mat was too whimsical for the community's aesthetic standards. I'd ignored most of it, paid the small fines when I had to, and tried to stay under her radar. But this was different. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values. This was about my ability to function as a human being in this environment. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office number listed on their website. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Patricia's voice, saccharine and professional, invited me to leave a message. I didn't. Instead, I looked up the other board members. The Pine Ridge HOA board consisted of 3 people. Patricia Henderson as president, a man named Robert Carlson as treasurer, and a woman named Susan Martinez as secretary. I'd met Robert once at a community meeting. He was a retired accountant who seemed perpetually nervous around Patricia, nodding agreement with everything she said. Susan I'd never met, but I found her number in the community directory. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." "Hi, Susan. This is Oliver Brennan. I live up on Ridge Road. I'm calling about an issue with Patricia Henderson." There was a long pause. "What kind of issue?" "She took my snowmobile keys this morning. She's demanding I store the snowmobile in my garage, but I can't access the main road without it. The private road to my property is completely impassable to regular vehicles." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan. If Patricia has identified a violation, you'll need to work it out with her directly. The board supports her enforcement actions." "Susan, she stole my property." "That's theft, regardless of whether there's an HOA violation." I'm sure Patricia had valid reasons for her actions. "Have you read Section 12, Paragraph 4? I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. "The snowmobile isn't recreational, it's necessary transportation." The bylaws don't distinguish between recreational and necessary use. A vehicle is a vehicle. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." She hung up before I could respond. I tried calling Robert Carlson next, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking him to call me back urgently. Then I sat at my kitchen table and actually read Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws. The language was frustratingly vague. All recreational vehicles, including but not limited to boats, jet skis, ATVs, dirt bikes, snowmobiles, and campers, must be stored in enclosed garages or behind privacy fencing sufficient to block them from view of neighboring properties and common areas. There was no exception for vehicles used as primary transportation. No acknowledgement that some properties in the development were only accessible by snowmobile during winter months. It was a rule written by someone who'd never actually lived in a mountain environment, or who'd lived here but never ventured beyond their perfectly plowed driveway. I looked at the clock. 9:30. The lumber delivery was scheduled for noon at the highway junction, about 3 miles from my cabin by snowmobile. I could theoretically hike there, but it would take at least 2 hours through deep snow, and I'd be exhausted by the time I arrived. Plus, how would I guide the delivery truck back? They couldn't follow my footprints and the trail markers were buried under snow. I needed those keys. Grabbing my coat, I headed back outside to my truck. It was a sturdy Ford F-250 with snow tires and 4-wheel drive. In most winter conditions, it could handle rough terrain. But this wasn't most winter conditions. The storm 3 days ago had dumped 30 inches of snow, and the temperature hadn't risen above 20 degrees since then. The snow on my private road was packed in some places, drifted in others, and completely impassable in the low-lying sections near the creeks. I started the truck anyway, letting it warm up while I grabbed a shovel from my workshop. Maybe I could make it a quarter mile, half a mile if I was lucky. That would be better than nothing. The truck handled the first 100 yards fine, plowing through snow that reached halfway up the tires. Then I hit the first drift. The front end plowed in, snow spraying up over the hood. The truck lurched, bucked, and stopped. I tried reversing. The wheels spun, found no traction, and dug deeper into the drift. 20 minutes of shoveling got me free, but I'd barely made a dent in the drift itself. There were dozens more between here and the highway. This was impossible. I returned to the cabin, parked the truck, and stood in my driveway staring at the snowmobile. It was a ski-doo expedition, a utility model designed for exactly this kind of situation. Reliable, powerful, and utterly useless without keys. A dark thought crossed my mind. I could hot-wire it. I'd worked on enough engines in my life to know the basics. But snowmobiles were trickier than cars with different ignition systems, and I risked damaging something expensive in the process. Plus, it would take time I didn't have. No, I needed to deal with Patricia directly. I drove my truck back down the private road as far as I could, then hiked the remaining distance to the main highway. It took 90 minutes of trudging through snow that sometimes reached my knees. By the time I reached the plowed highway, my legs burned with exhaustion, and sweat had soaked through my thermal layers despite the freezing temperature. Patricia's office was located in a small commercial building on the outskirts of Whitefish, sharing space with a real estate agency and an insurance broker. I arrived just before noon, my boots leaving puddles of melted snow on the polished floor. The office was exactly what I'd expected. Everything was aggressively organized, from the color-coded filing cabinets to the perfectly aligned pens on the desk. Patricia sat behind a computer, typing something with the intensity of a court stenographer. She looked up when I entered, and her expression soured immediately. "Mr. Brennan, I don't recall scheduling an appointment with you. I need my keys back, Patricia, right now. And I need you to comply with community regulations. We all have needs, don't we?" She returned her attention to her computer screen. I stepped closer to her desk, trying to keep my voice level. "I have a delivery coming in less than an hour. If I'm not there to meet the truck, they'll leave, and I won't be able to reschedule for weeks. I have orders depending on that lumber. Perhaps you should have considered that before violating HOA rules." "I'm not violating anything meaningful. The snowmobile is a tool, not a toy. It's the same as a tractor or a work truck." Patricia finally looked at me again, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach sink. She was enjoying this. The power, the control, The way she could disrupt my entire life with a simple act of petty theft disguised as rule enforcement. Mr. Brennan, I've dealt with your type before. You people move to these communities thinking the rules don't apply to you. You think because you paid for your property you can do whatever you want, but that's not how civilization works. We have standards, we have order, and you will comply or you will face consequences. Give me my keys or I'm calling the police. She actually laughed at that. Please do. Explain to them how you left your keys unsecured in your vehicle, how I'm holding them safely in my office, and how I'm simply enforcing legally binding HOA regulations that you signed and agreed to. See how far that gets you. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. Patricia watched me with amusement, not even bothering to look concerned. "Sir, this sounds like a civil matter," the dispatcher said. "If you believe property has been stolen, you can file a report, but officers typically can't intervene in HOA disputes. You might want to contact a lawyer." She took my keys without permission. How is that not theft? I understand your frustration, sir. Let me see if I can send an officer to mediate the situation. What's the address? I gave her Patricia's office address and hung up. Patricia was typing again, completely unfazed. "You're wasting everyone's time," she said without looking up. "The police won't help you. The courts will side with the HOA. You have no leverage here. Just move your snowmobile into your garage and you'll get your keys back. It's very simple." I wanted to argue more, but I needed to meet that lumber delivery. "I'll move it, but I need my keys now to get home and actually do that." "How do I know you won't just use the snowmobile and continue violating the rules?" "Because I'm telling you I'll comply." "Not good enough. I'll return your keys when I personally verify that the snowmobile has been properly stored." I stared at her, trying to process the circular logic. I couldn't move the snowmobile without the keys, but I couldn't get the keys without moving the snowmobile. "Patricia, that's impossible." "Then I suggest you figure something out, maybe call a friend with a trailer, or hire a moving company." She finally looked up, her expression ice cold. "Honestly, Mr. Brennan, this is not my problem. This is your problem, caused by your refusal to follow simple rules. Now I have work to do and you're trespassing in my office. Leave, or I'll call the police myself." I left, my hands shaking with rage. Outside, I called the lumber company and explained that I couldn't make the delivery. The woman on the phone was sympathetic, but firm. They couldn't reschedule for another 3 weeks, and there would be a restocking fee since the lumber was already on the truck. $200, plus the delay in fulfilling my customer orders. The police arrived 20 minutes later, a single officer in a Whitefish PD patrol car. He was in his mid-30s, with the patient expression of someone who'd mediated too many neighbor disputes. "You Oliver Brennan?" he asked. "That's me." "I'm Officer Davies. Want to explain what's going on?" I told him everything, from Patricia taking my keys to the snowmobile being my only transportation to her refusal to return my property. He listened, taking occasional notes. "And you have proof the snowmobile is necessary for access to your property?" he asked. "Drive out there and look at the road yourself. No regular vehicle is getting through until spring." Officer Davies thought for a moment. "Here's the thing. HOAs in Montana have pretty broad authority to enforce their bylaws. If you signed an agreement that says snowmobiles need to be stored out of sight, then technically she's within her rights to enforce that. As for the keys, it gets murky. She could argue she was securing unsecured property, especially if the keys were left in the ignition. So she can just steal from people. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's complicated. My advice: get a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes." There might be an argument that the bylaws are unreasonable given the specific circumstances of your property, but that's above my pay grade. What about right now? I need those keys today. Officer Davies walked into Patricia's office while I waited outside. I could hear muffled conversation but couldn't make out the words. 5 minutes later, he emerged, shaking his head. She's refusing to return the keys until you comply with the HOA regulations. She showed me the bylaws, and honestly, they do give her pretty broad enforcement authority. I can't force her to return property that was left unsecured, especially when she's claiming she's holding it for safekeeping. This is insane. I agree it's frustrating, but without clear evidence of criminal intent, this really is a civil matter. File a complaint with the HOA board, document everything, and talk to a lawyer. That's your best path forward. Officer Davies left, and I stood on the sidewalk feeling completely powerless. The sun was past its peak now, and the temperature was dropping. The storm system would arrive by evening, and I needed to get home before conditions deteriorated further. I started the long walk back to my truck, my mind spinning through options. I could try to hotwire the snowmobile, but that might cause permanent damage. I could break into Patricia's office tonight and steal the keys back, but that would make me the criminal. I could hire a lawyer, but that would take weeks or months, and I needed a solution now. By the time I reached my truck, my feet were numb and my face stung from wind exposure. I sat in the cab with the heater blasting, trying to think clearly, then my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello, Mr. Brennan. This is Amanda Zielinski. I live on Spruce Lane about a mile from your property. Okay. I heard about what happened with Patricia and your snowmobile. Susan Martinez's husband told my husband, and, well, I wanted you to know you're not the only one she's done this to. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? Last winter, Patricia confiscated my husband's ice auger because we had it sitting on our deck. She said it violated the rules about outdoor storage of fishing equipment. My husband needs that auger for his guiding business. He takes people ice fishing on Whitefish Lake. She held it for 3 weeks until we paid a $500 fine. That's extortion. That's Patricia. She's forced 6 families to sell their properties and move away over the past 4 years. She finds violations, imposes massive fines, and makes life so miserable that people just leave. Then someone in her extended family coincidentally buys the property at a discount. Are you serious? Completely. My husband and I have been documenting everything. We've talked to a lawyer about a class action suit, but it's expensive and complicated. Most people just want to move on with their lives. Amanda, I appreciate you telling me this, but right now I need a practical solution. I'm stuck at my property without any way to reach the main road. I know. That's why I'm calling. My husband has a snowmobile. We could loan it to you. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by suspicion. Won't Patricia come after you for that? Probably. But we're already on her target list. She's been trying to fine us for having too many vehicles parked in our driveway. Never mind that we have 6 people in our family and they're all old enough to drive. According to Patricia, we should rent additional garage space off property to store the excess vehicles. I don't want to cause problems for you. Mr. Brennan, the only way to deal with people like Patricia is to stand together. She relies on isolating people, making them think they're alone in fighting her. But if enough of us push back, document her abuses, and support each other, maybe we can actually fix this situation. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Okay, thank you. When can I pick up the snowmobile? Come by this evening. I'll text you our address. That night, after retrieving Amanda's snowmobile and making it back to my cabin safely ahead of the storm, I sat down and read every single page of the HOA bylaws. Not just Section 12, Paragraph 4. Everything. What I found was disturbing. The bylaws gave Patricia almost unlimited power to determine what constituted a violation, to set fine amounts, and to take necessary measures to enforce compliance. There was a process for appealing violations, but the appeals board consisted of the same three people who ran the HOA. Patricia, Robert, and Susan would be judging appeals against Patricia's decisions. It was a kangaroo court by design, but there were a few interesting clauses buried in the back sections. One stated that HOA board members could be removed by a vote of the community members if 60% signed a petition. Another stated that the bylaws could be amended by a 2/3 vote at an official community meeting. And there was a clause, probably inserted by some long-ago lawyer who actually understood Montana property law, stating that HOA regulations could not substantially interfere with a property owner's reasonable use and enjoyment of their property or create unsafe conditions. That might be my angle. Over the next week, I made phone calls. I talked to every property owner in the Pine Ridge development, introducing myself and asking about their experiences with the HOA. What I learned painted a clear picture. Patricia Henderson had moved to Whitefish 8 years ago after divorcing a wealthy dentist in Billings. She'd bought a large house in Pine Ridge and immediately inserted herself into the HOA leadership. Within 2 years, she'd driven out the previous board members through sheer attrition and installed her friends Robert and Susan. Since then, she'd systematically made life difficult for anyone who didn't conform to her vision of what the community should be. She targeted families with children, claiming they created too much noise and activity. She went after anyone who worked from home in a way that was visible to neighbors. She imposed fines for trivial aesthetic choices. And she seemed to particularly hate anyone who actually used their property for its intended mountain lifestyle purposes. Out of 12 properties, I found 7 owners willing to talk openly about their issues with Patricia. All 7 had stories similar to mine. Confiscated equipment, absurd fines, threats of legal action over minor or non-existent violations. 3 families were actively planning to sell and move away, not because they wanted to leave Whitefish, but because they couldn't stand dealing with Patricia anymore. I also learned something interesting. Patricia's nephew had purchased 3 properties in Pine Ridge over the past 4 years, always at prices below market value, always from families that Patricia had targeted with aggressive enforcement actions. That night, I called a lawyer in Kalispell who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Michael Thornton, and his initial consultation fee was $200 for an hour of his time. I paid it gladly. "Mr. Brennan, based on what you're telling me, you might have grounds for several legal challenges," he said over the phone. "First, there's the issue of whether the HOA's enforcement action substantially interferes with your property rights. If the snowmobile truly is necessary for access, a court might find that the HOA's actions are unreasonable. Second, there's the potential conflict of interest with Patricia's nephew buying properties at discounted prices after she's made life miserable for the owners. That could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. So I can fight this, you can. But it won't be quick or cheap. HOA litigation typically takes months, sometimes years, and you'll need to keep paying HOA fees and any fines during that time, or they can put a lien on your property. What about criminal charges? She stole my property. That's harder. She'd argue she was enforcing HOA rules and that you left the keys unsecured. A prosecutor would probably see it as a civil dispute and decline to file charges. But if you can establish a pattern of behavior, possibly involving fraud or extortion, that changes things. How do I prove that? Documentation. Get statements from other homeowners. Collect records of fines, enforcement actions, and property sales. Show that there's a coordinated scheme to devalue properties and allow her family members to buy them cheaply. If you can make that case, you might get law enforcement interested. I thanked Michael and spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what he suggested. I interviewed homeowners, collected written statements, and built a timeline showing how Patricia's enforcement actions preceded each property sale to her nephew. I obtained property records from the county showing the purchase prices versus market comps. The pattern was undeniable. Patricia would target a family, impose increasingly harsh fines, and make their lives miserable until they agreed to sell. Then her nephew, a real estate investor named Derek Henderson, would swoop in with a cash offer significantly below market value. The families, exhausted and desperate to escape, would accept. Derek would hold the property for a few months, then resell it for a 30 to 50% profit. Over 4 years, this scheme had generated approximately $600,000 in profit for Derek. I had no way to prove whether Patricia received a cut, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Armed with this information, I went back to the Whitefish Police Department. Officer Davies listened to my presentation, examining the documents I'd compiled. "This is more substantial than a simple HOA dispute," he admitted, "but I'll need to run it past my sergeant and probably the county prosecutor. This kind of case requires careful handling." "How long will that take?" "A few days, maybe a week." "In the meantime, don't do anything to antagonize Patricia. Keep documenting, keep paying your fees, and stay clean." I agreed, though it was frustrating to wait when I still didn't have my snowmobile keys back. I was managing with Amanda's borrowed snowmobile, but that was a temporary solution. Patricia had sent me 3 more violation notices in the past week, each one citing new and increasingly absurd infractions. My cabin's paint color was inconsistent with community standards. My firewood pile created a fire hazard and visual blight. My mailbox showed signs of weather damage that needed to be addressed immediately. Each notice came with a threatened fine of $100 to $300 if I didn't comply within 7 days. I responded to each notice in writing, stating that I disputed the violation and requesting a formal hearing before the HOA board. As expected, Patricia scheduled all 3 hearings for the same evening, giving me 2 days' notice. The hearing took place in Patricia's office, with Robert and Susan sitting on either side of her like silent sentinels. I brought my documentation, my lawyer on speakerphone, and a recording device that I placed prominently on the desk. "Mr. Brennan, you can't record this hearing," Patricia said immediately. "Montana is a one-party consent state for recordings." Michael's voice came through the phone speaker. "Mr. Brennan has every right to record a proceeding that directly concerns him." Patricia's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue further. "Fine. Let's begin with the first violation. Your cabin's exterior paint is not consistent with the approved color palette for the community." "Which color palette?" I asked. "I've reviewed the bylaws and there's no specified palette." "There's a vague reference to earth tones but no objective standard. The standard is determined by the board's aesthetic judgment. So you can arbitrarily decide my paint is wrong even though it's the same color it was when I bought the property. The previous owner was also in violation. We're simply enforcing standards that should have been enforced earlier." Michael's voice cut in. "Miss Henderson, are you stating that you're retroactively enforcing a standard that you previously accepted? Because that could be considered arbitrary and capricious enforcement, which is grounds for invalidating the violation." Patricia ignored him and moved to the next item. The firewood pile constitutes a hazard and a blight. It's firewood. I burn it for heat. It's stored 30 feet from my cabin, which exceeds fire safety recommendations. It's visible from the road. So is everyone else's firewood in this community. Are you citing them as well? We'll address other properties as needed. In other words, you're selectively enforcing this rule against me. The hearing continued for 40 minutes, with Patricia presenting her violations and me systematically dismantling each one. Robert and Susan said almost nothing, only nodding when Patricia looked at them for support. At the end, Patricia announced that all 3 violations were upheld and that I owed $800 in total fines, due within 30 days. I'm appealing these violations, I said calmly. You can appeal to the board. You are the board. I'm appealing to an actual neutral party, which means court. You'll lose. Maybe, but it'll cost you time and legal fees either way. I left the hearing feeling both angry and strangely energized. Patricia had made mistakes during the proceeding, admitting to selective enforcement and failing to point to objective standards. Michael had heard it all, and he was confident we could use it in court. But the legal process was slow, and I was still stuck without my snowmobile keys. Spring was months away, and I couldn't rely on borrowing Amanda's snowmobile indefinitely. Then something unexpected happened. 2 days after the hearing, I received a call from a detective with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. Her name was Detective Laura Morrison, and she wanted to meet with me about Patricia Henderson. Mr. Brennan, we've received multiple complaints about Miss Henderson's activities over the past year, Detective Morrison explained when we met at a coffee shop in Kalispell. Individually, they seemed like civil disputes, but collectively, they paint a picture of potential fraud and extortion. So you're investigating her. We're in the preliminary stages. Officer Davies from Whitefish PD brought your information to our attention, and it corroborated other reports we've received. I'd like to get a formal statement from you and copies of your documentation. I provided everything I had, walking her through the timeline of Patricia's enforcement actions and Derek Henderson's subsequent property purchases. Detective Morrison took careful notes and asked detailed questions. "Has Patricia returned your snowmobile keys?" she asked. "No. I've been using a borrowed snowmobile for the past 3 weeks, and you've documented that she took them without permission." "I've documented it, told multiple witnesses, and filed a report with Whitefish PD." "Good, keep documenting everything. If she continues to harass you, note the dates, times, and specific actions. We're building a case, but it takes time." "How much time?" "Honestly, weeks at minimum, possibly months. White-collar cases like this require substantial evidence and coordination with the county prosecutor. But I can tell you that we're taking this seriously." I left the meeting feeling cautiously hopeful, but still frustrated with the glacial pace of justice. That weekend, I called a community meeting using the procedures outlined in the HOA bylaws. Any homeowner could call a meeting with 7 days' notice posted to all property owners. I sent certified letters to every address in the Pine Ridge development, stating that the meeting would address concerns regarding HOA governance and enforcement practices. Patricia tried to block it, sending her own letter claiming I didn't have authority to call meetings. But the bylaws were clear, and I had Michael Thornton ready to intervene if she tried anything illegal. The meeting took place on a cold Saturday morning in the community clubhouse, a small building near the development's entrance that mostly sat unused. 9 of the 12 property owners showed up, including Patricia, Robert, and Susan. I stood at the front of the room and addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you have experienced issues with the current HOA board, particularly with enforcement practices that seem arbitrary and targeted. I'm here to propose that we exercise our rights under the bylaws to remove the current board and elect new leadership. Patricia shot to her feet. You can't do this. This meeting is illegitimate. It's completely legitimate according to Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws. I've followed every procedure. This is a coup attempt. This is democracy. These people have the right to vote on their leadership. For the next hour, we discussed the issues. Amanda Zielinski spoke about her family's experiences. A man named George Tanner described how Patricia had forced him to repaint his entire house over a color that was barely distinguishable from the previous shade. A couple named Frank and Jennifer Rodriguez explained how they were seriously considering bankruptcy because of accumulated HOA fines. Robert and Susan remained mostly silent, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the stories piled up. Patricia tried to defend each action, claiming she was simply enforcing rules that everyone had agreed to, but her arguments fell flat in the face of so much concrete testimony. When it came time to vote, I distributed ballots asking two questions. Should the current board be removed? If yes, who should serve as the new board? The vote was unanimous among the 9 property owners present. Patricia, Robert, and Susan were removed immediately. A new board was elected consisting of Amanda Zielinski as president, George Tanner as treasurer, and Frank Rodriguez as secretary. Patricia's face had gone from red to purple during the vote count. She stood up, grabbed her binder, and pointed at me. You haven't won anything. I'll see you in court. I'll sue you personally for defamation. You'll regret this. Patricia, you're welcome to try. But you might want to save your money for a criminal defense attorney. She froze. What are you talking about? The Flathead County Sheriff's Office is investigating you for fraud and extortion. You might want to call your nephew Derek and let him know he'll probably be getting some questions too. Patricia's expression shifted from anger to something closer to fear. She looked at Robert and Susan, but they avoided her gaze. Without another word, she walked out of the clubhouse, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. The room erupted in conversation after she left. People were relieved, excited, and nervous about what came next. Amanda stepped up to the front and addressed the group. First order of business. We're suspending all fines and enforcement actions pending a complete review of the bylaws. Second, we're forming a committee to rewrite the rules to be clear, objective, and reasonable. Third, Oliver, do you still need your snowmobile keys? Yes. Then let's go get them. Anyone know where Patricia kept confiscated items? Susan finally spoke up, her voice quiet. She has a storage unit in town. I have the address and the access code. 20 minutes later, a group of us pulled up to a storage facility on Highway 93. Susan led us to Unit 147, punched in the code, and rolled up the door. Inside was a shocking collection of confiscated property. Tools, garden decorations, outdoor furniture, sports equipment, and more. Everything was neatly labeled with the owner's name and the date of confiscation. My snowmobile keys were in a small box labeled Brennan, violation ref. 2025-12-22. I pocketed the keys, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Other people found their confiscated items too. Amanda's husband found his ice auger. George found a set of custom lawn decorations that Patricia had claimed violated some aesthetic standard. We should document all of this, I said, pulling out my phone to take photos. The detective investigating Patricia will want to see it. Everyone agreed, and we spent the next hour cataloging everything in the storage unit. The collection represented thousands of dollars of property that Patricia had taken from people under the guise of HOA enforcement. On Monday morning, I delivered the photos and a detailed inventory to Detective Morrison. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the images. "This is extremely helpful, Mr. Brennan." Combined with the financial records showing the pattern of property sales to her nephew, we have a strong case for criminal charges. What happens now? I'll present everything to the prosecutor. If they agree, we'll seek warrants and move forward with arrests. How long? Couple weeks, probably. These things don't happen overnight, but we're close. I went home feeling satisfied but also exhausted. The past month had been a constant battle and I was ready for things to settle down. I still had customer orders to fill, a workshop to run, and a life to live. Using my reclaimed snowmobile, I caught up on the work I'd fallen behind on. The lumber delivery had been rescheduled, and I threw myself into the projects that had been languishing. The rhythmic work of cutting, sanding, and assembling helped clear my mind. Amanda and the new HOA board were true to their word. They immediately suspended all outstanding fines and began the process of rewriting the bylaws. They held open meetings where community members could voice their concerns and suggestions. The new rules focused on genuine safety issues and property maintenance, while eliminating the vague, subjective standards that Patricia had weaponized. The snowmobile storage rule was completely rewritten to acknowledge that some properties required alternative transportation during winter months. As long as the vehicle was functional and not derelict, it could be stored wherever the owner needed it. 3 weeks after the community meeting, Detective Morrison called me with news. "We've arrested Patricia Henderson and Derek Henderson. They're both being charged with multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and theft. The prosecutor is taking this seriously." "What about Robert and Susan?" "They're cooperating witnesses. Based on their testimony, they were essentially bullied into going along with Patricia's schemes. They'll probably face civil liability but not criminal charges." "When's the trial?" "Months away, probably. These cases take time to prepare, but I thought you'd want to know that justice is moving forward." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Patricia was being held accountable. Satisfaction that I'd stood up for myself and others. But also a lingering sadness that it had come to this at all. The next few months were relatively peaceful. Winter began to loosen its grip on Montana, and the snow on my private road gradually melted enough that I could use my truck again. The snowmobile sat in my driveway, no longer a source of conflict, just a tool waiting for next winter. Patricia and Derek both pled not guilty and hired expensive lawyers. The case made local news, with articles describing how an HOA president had allegedly run a scheme to devalue properties for her family's financial gain. Other victims came forward, people from neighboring developments who'd had similar experiences with Patricia in her previous roles. The trial was scheduled for late summer. The prosecutor offered plea deals, but both Patricia and Derek rejected them, insisting they'd done nothing wrong. I was called to testify during the preliminary hearings. I described the incident with my snowmobile keys, the pattern of enforcement actions, and the evidence I'd helped gather. Patricia's lawyer tried to paint me as a troublemaker who'd orchestrated a vendetta against his client, but the sheer volume of evidence from multiple victims undermined that narrative. In August, the trial began. It lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and experts analyzing property records, financial transactions, and HOA documents. The prosecution methodically built their case, showing how Patricia had systematically targeted homeowners, imposed unjustified fines, and created conditions that forced people to sell at a loss to her nephew. The defense argued that Patricia had simply been enforcing HOA rules as written, and that any financial benefit to her nephew was coincidental. But the jury didn't buy it. Patricia Henderson was convicted on 4 counts of fraud, 3 counts of extortion, and multiple counts of theft. Derek Henderson was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. The judge sentenced Patricia to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay restitution totaling nearly $400,000. Derek received 3 years and similar restitution requirements. I sat in the courtroom when the verdicts were read, watching Patricia's face crumble as each guilty verdict was announced. Part of me felt sorry for her. She destroyed her own life through greed and a pathological need for control. But mostly, I felt vindicated. After the trial, the Pine Ridge community continued to heal. The new HOA board was functioning well, focused on genuine community needs rather than petty enforcement. Property values actually increased once word spread that the toxic leadership was gone. Several families who'd been planning to leave decided to stay. I finished the custom furniture orders I'd fallen behind on and took on new projects. My workshop became known locally for quality craftsmanship, and I started getting commissions from interior designers in Kalispell and Whitefish. On a crisp October morning, with the first snow of the season dusting the peaks of the Mission Mountains, I stood in my driveway looking at my snowmobile. It was fueled, maintained, and ready for another winter. The keys hung on a hook inside my cabin, easily accessible but secure. Amanda stopped by later that day with her husband and kids. They'd brought homemade chili and cornbread, a thank you for everything I'd done to help resolve the Patricia situation. "You know, Oliver, you could have just moved away like so many others did," Amanda said as we sat on my deck watching the sun set. "Why did you dig in and fight?" I thought about it for a moment. Because it was wrong. Because she was hurting people and getting away with it. And because I'd spent too much of my life compromising and avoiding conflict. I came here to build something, to live on my own terms. I wasn't going to let some petty tyrant take that away from me. "Well, we're glad you fought. Things are so much better now." She was right. The community felt different, lighter somehow. People waved to each other on the roads. Neighbors helped neighbors with projects and problems. The HOA had become what it was supposed to be, a simple organizational structure to handle shared concerns, not a weapon for control. Winter came in full force by November, and my snowmobile returned to its essential role as lifeline to the outside world. I made regular trips to town for supplies, materials, and the occasional social outing. The machine hummed reliably beneath me as I navigated the frozen landscape, the keys safely in my pocket. I never did get an apology from Patricia. She maintained her innocence through the appeals process, claiming she'd been unfairly targeted and that the convictions were the result of a conspiracy against her. But the evidence had been overwhelming, and her appeals were denied. Derek ended up serving his sentence at a minimum security facility in Shelby, Montana. Patricia went to the women's prison in Billings. I didn't follow their cases closely after the initial sentencing. They'd taken up enough of my mental energy, and I was ready to move on. The restitution money was distributed among the victims based on documented losses. I received about $8,000, covering the fines I'd paid, the lost lumber delivery fee, legal expenses, and compensation for the time I'd spent borrowing Amanda's snowmobile. It felt good to be made whole, even though no amount of money could return the stress and frustration of those winter months. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after Patricia had first taken my keys, I sat in my workshop putting the finishing touches on a custom dining table made from Montana black walnut. Snow fell softly outside, and my wood stove kept the space warm and comfortable. The radio played classic rock, and I lost myself in the meditative work of hand sanding the grain to perfect smoothness. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. The HOA board was having a holiday party at the clubhouse, and everyone was invited. Potluck dinner, white elephant gift exchange, and general celebration of making it through a difficult year. I decided to go. I made my specialty chili, grabbed a bottle of wine for the white elephant, and fired up my snowmobile for the short trip to the clubhouse. The gathering was warm and friendly, full of people who'd become real neighbors rather than just nearby property owners. We ate, laughed, and exchanged ridiculous white elephant gifts. George Tanner ended up with a singing fish plaque. Amanda got a set of flamingo garden stakes that she immediately declared would go in her front yard. HOA approval not required since she was the HOA. At one point, Frank Rodriguez raised his glass and proposed a toast. To Oliver Brennan, who taught us that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they hide behind rules and regulations, and to better days ahead. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a genuine warmth that had nothing to do with the wine or the crowded room. This was community, real community, built on mutual respect and support rather than fear and control. Riding home that night under a sky full of stars, my snowmobile's headlight cutting through the darkness, I reflected on the journey. It had started with such a simple, stupid conflict. A woman with too much power and too little wisdom, stealing keys because she could, because the rules gave her permission, because she enjoyed the control. But that conflict had revealed deeper problems and brought people together to solve them. It had forced me to engage with my neighbors, to fight for something that mattered, and to help build something better than what had existed before. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing with the warm light I'd left on. I parked the snowmobile in the driveway, right out in the open where it belonged, and headed inside. Spring would come eventually, melting the snow and opening up the roads. But until then, I had my snowmobile, my keys, and my freedom to come and go as I needed. No one would take that away again. Inside, I poured myself a whiskey and sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of burning wood. My phone buzzed with photos from the party, smiling faces and silly moments captured digitally. I scrolled through them, saving a few favorites. Life in the mountains wasn't always easy. The winters were harsh, the isolation could be challenging, and dealing with the practical realities of remote living required constant adaptation. But it was worth it. The peace, the beauty, the sense of building something with my own hands, all of it made the difficulties worthwhile. And knowing that I'd stood up for myself and others, that I hadn't just accepted injustice, because fighting it was hard, that gave me a satisfaction that went deeper than any convenience or comfort. Patricia Henderson was in prison, serving time for the crimes she'd committed under the guise of community service. Her nephew was in prison too, paying the price for his participation in the scheme. The properties they'd devalued through their manipulations were recovering their value. The families they'd driven away were gone, but the ones who remained were stronger and more united. Justice had been slow, frustrating, and imperfect. But it had arrived. I finished my whiskey and headed to bed, the cabin warm and secure around me. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding inches to the already substantial pack. Tomorrow I'd probably need to use the snowmobile to get to town for supplies, and I'd do it without a second thought, keys in my pocket, free to move through the landscape I'd chosen as my home. The HOA couldn't stop me. Patricia couldn't stop me. The rules had been rewritten to reflect reality rather than arbitrary control. And if anyone ever tried to pull something like that again, they'd find a community ready to stand together and fight back. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the strange trajectory that had brought me here. Selling my company in Seattle, buying a mountain cabin, getting caught up in an HOA nightmare, and emerging on the other side with real friendships and a genuine sense of belonging. Life rarely goes the way you expect, but sometimes the detours and conflicts lead you to places and people that make everything worthwhile. My last conscious thought before sleep took me was simple. I'm glad I stayed. I'm glad I fought. I'm glad I didn't let her win. And tomorrow, I'd wake up and do it all again. Build furniture, navigate winter, live free in the mountains, with my snowmobile keys safely where they belonged and my life entirely my own. The story could have ended there, but life has a way of adding epilogues when you least expect them. In March, as winter finally began loosening its grip and the snowpack started its slow melt, I received a letter from Patricia Henderson. It had been forwarded through her lawyer, who apparently handled her correspondence from prison. I almost threw it away without reading it. What could she possibly have to say that I wanted to hear? But curiosity won out, and I opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten, neat and precise like everything Patricia did. It read, "Mr. Brennan, I am writing to you against the advice of my attorney, who thinks any communication with you is a mistake. Perhaps he's right, but I've had a lot of time to think in here and there are things I need to say. I am not going to claim I was innocent. The jury decided otherwise and I've accepted my conviction. But I want you to understand something. I never set out to hurt anyone. I genuinely believed I was improving the community, maintaining standards, protecting property values. The problem is that somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the community and started being about me, about my control, about proving I was right and everyone else was wrong. And yes, about the money my nephew was making, though I told myself that was just a side benefit of good governance. When you took my keys, I saw you as a threat to everything I'd built. I didn't see you as a human being with legitimate needs. I didn't care that the snowmobile was your lifeline. I only cared that you were defying me. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. I hurt people out of pride and greed disguised as civic duty. I hope the community is doing well. I hope you're able to enjoy your property the way you intended when you bought it. And I hope that my time in here serves as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to abuse the kind of power that HOA positions provide. Patricia Henderson. I read the letter twice, trying to determine if it was genuine or just another manipulation. Ultimately, I decided it didn't matter. She was in prison. The community had moved on, and whether she'd actually learned anything or was just saying what she thought would help her case on appeal, it changed nothing about my life. I filed the letter away with the rest of the documentation from the case and didn't respond. By April, the roads were passable again, and I switched back to using my truck for most trips. The snowmobile got a thorough maintenance check and was stored properly in my workshop, where I'd made space by reorganizing some equipment. It would be ready when winter returned, as it inevitably would. The new HOA board had finished rewriting the bylaws, and the community had voted to approve them. The new rules were clear, objective, and focused on genuine issues rather than aesthetic preferences. There were regulations about property maintenance, safety concerns, and shared resource management. But there was nothing about paint colors, mailbox heights, or whether your firewood was stacked in an appropriately picturesque manner. property values in Pine Ridge stabilized and then began to climb. Two of the properties that Derek Henderson had purchased and flipped were sold again, this time to families who were actually planning to live in them long term. The community was slowly filling in with people who wanted to be there, who appreciated the mountain lifestyle, and who understood that being neighbors meant supporting each other, not policing each other. My woodworking business continued to grow. I hired a part-time assistant, a young guy named Marcus who was learning the trade and appreciated having someone patient enough to teach him. We worked well together, and the additional help allowed me to take on larger projects. In May, I was commissioned to build a complete bedroom set for a client in Bozeman. Custom bed frame, matching nightstands, a dresser, and an armoire, all from reclaimed barn wood. It was the biggest project I'd done since moving to Montana, and I threw myself into it with enthusiasm. Marcus and I spent long days in the workshop, measuring, cutting, and assembling. The smell of wood dust and finish filled the air, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional never got old. One afternoon, Amanda stopped by with her youngest daughter, who was 7 and fascinated by tools. I let the girl try sanding a piece of scrap wood under careful supervision while Amanda and I talked. "Have you heard about the new people buying the Henderson property?" Amanda asked. "Patricia's old house. No, what about them? They're a young couple from Seattle. He's a software engineer who's going fully remote and she's a writer. They seem really nice. I talked to them at the realtor's open house last week. Did they know about the history?" "Oh yeah." The realtor was upfront about everything. Honestly, I think it actually made them more interested. They liked hearing that the community had dealt with a problem and come out stronger. Good for them. Hope they're prepared for winter. I gave them your number, said you could help them with winterizing advice and figuring out the snowmobile situation. I nodded. Happy to help. The new neighbors, whose names turned out to be David and Rachel Spencer, did reach out a few weeks later. I spent an afternoon showing David around, explaining the peculiarities of mountain living and demonstrating my snowmobile. They were enthusiastic and asked good questions, and I could tell they'd actually thrive here once they got past the initial learning curve. Summer in Montana is spectacular, and I made sure to take time away from work to enjoy it. I went hiking in Glacier National Park, took a fly fishing trip on the South Fork of the Flathead River, and attended the local 4th of July celebration in Whitefish. At the celebration, I ran into Officer Davies, the cop who'd first responded to my call about Patricia. He was off duty in civilian clothes, eating a hamburger while his kids played nearby. "Mr. Brennan, right?" he said, offering his hand. "Good to see you. How's everything going out at Pine Ridge?" "Much better. New HOA board, new rules, no more drama." "Glad to hear it. That Patricia Henderson case was something else. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I'd never seen an HOA situation turn into actual criminal charges before." "Yeah, it was a unique situation. You did good work documenting everything, made it possible to actually build a case. Most people just suffer through HOA problems or move away." I thought about moving, but I liked my property too much to let her drive me off it. Officer Davies grinned. "Well, Montana needs more people with that attitude. Enjoy the summer." As fall approached, I finished the bedroom set for the Bozeman client and delivered it personally. The client was thrilled, posting pictures on social media that led to 3 new inquiries. My little one-person operation, now 2-person with Marcus, was becoming a legitimate business. In October, the first snow fell again, right on schedule. I watched it from my workshop window, white flakes drifting down through the pines, beginning the transformation that would turn the landscape back into a winter wonderland. That evening, I pulled out the snowmobile, checked all the systems, and took it for a test run up and down my private road. Everything worked perfectly. The machine was ready for another season of being my lifeline to civilization. I thought about Patricia for a moment, wondered if she was watching snow fall outside her prison window and thinking about the choices that had brought her there. But only for a moment. She was part of my past now, a challenge I'd overcome and moved beyond. The present was good. The future looked promising. And I had my keys, my freedom, and my life exactly as I wanted it to be. Standing in my driveway as the sun set behind the mountains and the first snow of winter accumulated on my shoulders, I felt profoundly grateful. Not just for the specific circumstances of my life, but for the harder lesson I'd learned. Sometimes standing up for yourself means fighting battles you'd rather avoid. Sometimes doing the right thing is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally exhausting. But the alternative, letting bullies and petty tyrants win because fighting them is hard, that's worse. I'd fought. I'd won. And in the process, I'd helped others fight and win too. That was worth more than all the peaceful mountain solitude in the world. I headed inside, stomped the snow off my boots, and started a fire in the wood stove. Outside, winter was settling in for its long stay. Inside, I was warm, safe, and exactly where I belonged. My snowmobile sat in the driveway, keys on the hook by the door, ready whenever I needed it. No one would take that away again. I'd made sure of that, and if anyone ever tried, well, I knew exactly what to do. Document everything, stand firm, bring people together, and fight back through every legal channel available. Because in the end, that's what community really means. Not following arbitrary rules enforced by petty tyrants, but standing together to protect everyone's right to live peacefully and freely. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and I settled into my favorite chair with a book and a cup of tea. Another Montana winter had begun, and I was ready for whatever it brought. My story with Patricia Henderson was over. But the life I'd built in the aftermath, the friendships I'd formed, and the lessons I'd learned, those would last much longer than any winter. And every time I climbed onto my snowmobile and headed down that private road, keys safely in my pocket, I'd remember why I'd fought so hard to keep them. Freedom isn't free. Sometimes you have to battle HOA Karens to maintain it, but it's always, always worth the fight.